Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Nice to be back with you again. You had classes on Saturday and Sunday also.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So you learned about post-colonialism. That was the topic that was discussed.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
No, Reg drove the.
Ma'am, sir has started with the introduction part of Fanon, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. Means he was telling about the post-colonial era completely.
Okay. That's good. Anyway, let's first finish what we were doing, and then then we'll go on to our next topic. So there are 10 of you who have joined, so I think we can begin now. Let's just try to finish this text by Foucault in the first half of today's class. Okay. So in the last class, we'd stopped here where he says that this work that he has proposed, this creation of the critical ontology of ourselves, this has some features which justify it. And he says that those features are its generality, its systematicity, and its homogeneity. And he also talks about some things which are at stake for which this exercise or this inquiry into our philosophical ethos is necessary. So first of all, he talks about the stakes, and he says that the stakes may be indicated by what may be called the paradox of the relations of capacity and power. He says, we know that the great promise or the great hope of the 18th century, that is the age of enlightenment, or a part of the 18th century, lay in the simultaneous and proportional growth of individuals with respect to one another. That is the tolerance that was there. And moreover, we can see that throughout the entire history of Western societies, it is perhaps here that the root of their singular historical destiny is located, such a peculiar destiny, so different from the others in its trajectory, and so universalizing, so dominant with respect to the others. The acquisition of capabilities and the struggle for freedom have constituted permanent elements. Now, the relations between the growth of capabilities and the growth of autonomy are not as simple as the 18th century may have believed. And we have been able to see what forms of power relation were conveyed by various technologies, disciplines, both collective and individual, procedures of normalization exercised in the name of the power of the state, demands of society or of population zones are examples. What is at stake then is this: how can the growth of capabilities be disconnected from the intensification of power relations? So this is the reason why this analysis, he says, has to be undertaken, even though it may appear to be, limited in its scope, even though we may be at the risk of losing control over ourselves. Yet it is necessary, because he says that we have to know how the growth of capabilities can be disconnected from the intensification of power relations, meaning to say that how we can continue to function as free and liberal individuals, how we can, you can say, assure our own individual freedom, how we should be able to grow our capabilities, how we should be able to develop without being under the pressure of power relations. So this, he says, is at stake. After that, he talks about the homogeneity, which is the uniformity in the method that he proposes. And he says, this leads to the study of what could be called practical systems. Here we are taking as a homogeneous domain of reference, not the representations that men give of themselves, not the conditions that determine them without their knowledge, but rather what they do and the way they do it. That is, the forms of rationality that organize their ways of doing things. This might be called the technological aspect, and the freedom with which they act within these practical systems, reacting to what others do, modifying the rules of the game up to a certain point. This may be called the strategic side of these practices. The homogeneity of these historico-critical analysis is thus ensured by this realm of practices with their technological side and their strategic side. So he says that these things, which he calls practical systems, are what are to be studied. And these practical systems are basically what all people do and and the way that they do it. And he says that these practical systems, they have two aspects, the technological aspect and the strategic aspect. And the main thing that he is saying is that these practical systems are uniform. There is a homogeneity in these practical systems. Okay, after that, he talks about the systematicity, and he says that these practical systems stem from three broad areas, which are relations of control over things, relations of action upon others, relations with oneself. This does not mean that each of these three areas is completely foreign to the others. It is well known that control over things is mediated by relations with others, and relations with others in turn always entail relations with oneself and vice versa. Meaning to say that these three broad areas, which constitute what are called the practical systems, that is the way in which we do things, and how we do things and why we do things. Now these are, you can say, these are guided by these three areas, that is the relations of control over things, relations of action upon others, and relations with oneself. And these three areas are not mutually separate from each other, but they are in a way interactive. So he says that, but we have three axes whose specificity and whose interconnections have to be analyzed. The axis of knowledge, the axis of knowledge is the relation of control over things. The axis of power, which is the relation of action upon others, and the axis of ethics, which is the relation that we have with ourselves. In other terms, the historical ontology of ourselves has to answer an open series of questions. It has to make an indefinite number of inquiries, which may be multiplied and specified as much as we like, but which will all address the questions systemized as follows. How are we constituted as subjects of our own knowledge? How are we constituted as subjects who exercise or submit to power relations? And how are we constituted as moral subjects of our own actions? So this, he says, is the systematicity of the approach or the exercise that he has proposed. And this is what he hopes to learn. This is the knowledge that he hopes to get. Now, the next point that he talks about is the generality. And he says, finally, these historico-critical investigations are quite specific in the sense that they always bear upon a material, an epoch, a body of determined practices and discourses. And yet, at least at the level of the Western societies from which we derive, they have their generality, in the sense that they have continued to recur up to our time. For example, the problem of the relationship between sanity and insanity, or sickness and health, or crime and the law, the problem of the role of sexual relations, and so on. But by evoking this generality, I do not mean to suggest that it has to be retraced in its meta-historical continuity over time, nor that its variations have to be pursued. What must be grasped is the extent to which we know of it, the forms of power that are exercised in it, and the experience that we have in it of ourselves, constitute nothing but determined historical figures through a certain form of problematization that defines objects, rules of action, modes of relation to oneself. So, in this, what he is saying is that whatever the investigations that we are taking up, they may appear to be specific to any one object or to any one period or to any particular kind of practices and discourses, but the fact is that they have a generality because they keep recurring. They do not end with one particular, object or one particular period or one particular practice or discourse. It keeps repeating itself. This kind of historico-critical investigation, it keeps repeating itself, and that is why there is a generality in it. And in this generality, the main thing that he says is the issue of problematization. Problematization means a kind of theorizing, or it is a kind of an exercise which, according to Foucault, is essential, because he says that he has always maintained right from the beginning that he is more interested in uncovering a problem, in disclosing a problem, or in discovering the underlying problem which is hidden, rather than in offering a solution. And he says that things that are taken for granted, that are accepted as they are, they have to be raised, or a kind of a problem has to be created, because it is this problem which will lead to discussions, which will lead to debate, which will lead to new reactions, and it will create the crisis. And through this, through these discursive practices, one will be aware of, or the knowledge of, the power structures. This will unravel the relations of power that are at work. And this, according to Foucault, is what basically he is a historian of ideas, and it is this issue of problematization that will lead to this, this analysis of history on the basis of ideas. So he says that the generality of this approach, these investigations that he has proposed, that is one important justification for it, because it, it carries with it this issue of problematization that he says that defines objects, rules of action, modes of relation to oneself. So the study of problematization, he says, which is neither an anthropological constant nor a chronological variation, is the way to analyze questions of general import in their historically unique form. Okay, so with this we come to the conclusion of this entire analysis, or this entire commentary that Foucault has made on enlightenment, on Kant's meaning of enlightenment, interpretation of enlightenment, and what it means for the general, the individual. What is enlightenment, and how it is to be, how it is, it is not a period, it is not an epoch, rather it is an attitude that should inform us. And what is the essence of that attitude? What is the significance of that attitude? So he says, a brief summary to conclude and to come back to Kant. I do not know whether we will ever reach mature adulthood. Many things in our experience convince us that the historical event of the Enlightenment did not make us mature adults, and we have not reached that stage yet. However, it seems to me that a meaning can be attributed to that critical interrogation on the present and on ourselves, which can't be formulated by reflecting on the Enlightenment. This is the significance of the Enlightenment, though he says that this, this exit from immaturity that had been proposed, this this attainment of a mature state, all those things have not materialized yet. They have not happened yet. Yet, however, the Enlightenment is important because through, you can say through the internalization of the Enlightenment principle, a meaning can be attributed to that interrogation on the present and ourselves. It seems to me that Kant's reflection is even a way of philosophizing that has not been without its importance or effectiveness during the last 2 centuries. The critical ontology of ourselves has to be considered not certainly as a theory, a doctrine, nor even as a permanent body of knowledge that is accumulating. It has to be conceived as an attitude, an ethos, a philosophical life in which the critique of what we are is at one and the same time the historical analysis of the limits that are imposed on us and an experiment with the possibility of going beyond them. So he says that this is the essence of the Enlightenment, that it promotes in us a kind of an attitude. It brings before us a philosophical life in which this, this analysis of what we are is at the same time a historical analysis. This critical analysis or philosophical analysis of ourselves is also a historical analysis, because through this historical analysis, or only through the historical analysis, we come to understand or recognize, or we come to a knowledge of the limits that are imposed on us, and we become aware of, or we are able to experiment with the possibility of going beyond them, of transcending these limits which have been imposed upon us. This philosophical attitude has to be translated into the labor of diverse inquiries. So he says that this philosophical attitude, it should not remain only theoretical, but rather it has to be translated into diverse inquiries, practical, it has to be put into practice. These inquiries have their methodological coherence in the at once archaeological and genealogical study of practices envisaged simultaneously as a technological type of rationality and as strategic games of liberty. So he says that these inquiries, they have a methodological coherence, meaning there is a method to it, and that method is the archaeological and the genealogical study of the technological type of rationality and the strategic games of liberty that he had talked about earlier on page 48. These practical systems that he had talked about, which are of 2 types, the technological aspect and the strategic practices. So that is the methodology of this philosophical attitude. And then he says they have their theoretical coherence in the definition of the historically unique forms in which the generalities of our relations to things, to others, to ourselves have been problematized. So the theory, there is a theoretical coherence also, or a theoretical basis also in the systematicity or the generality that he had talked about earlier, this issue of problematization. Then he says they have their practical coherence in the care brought to the process of putting historico-critical reflection to the test of concrete practices. So the practical coherence of this attitude will consist in the care that is brought to the process of putting this historico-critical reflection to the test of concrete practices. How they will be actually put into practice, how they will be actually brought into our way of doing things and of our way of the reason for doing things. I do not know whether it must be said today that the critical task still entails faith in enlightenment. I continue to think that this task requires work on our limits, that is, a patient labor giving form to our impatience for liberty. So what he means to say is that we need to retain our faith in the enlightenment, or rather in this philosophical attitude that can be developed through this internalization of the enlightenment. And the task that we have on hand, he says, is to work on our limits, the limits that have been imposed upon us. We have to work patiently on these limits, on extending these limits through experimentation, on extending these limits. And he says that is what he means by a patient labor giving form to our impatience for liberty. And it is only when we work upon these limits, only when we know the limits and then find ways to transcend these limits, can we come to a complete, state of liberty. Can we come to that state where we may be able to, you can say, separate ourselves from the, what he had earlier said, separate ourselves from the, disconnect ourselves from the intensification of power relations. Okay, so that is the end of this essay. So are you all listening? Are you all listening?
Yes,
or
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'm
Yes.
listening.
So are there any questions? I had asked you to read through this last section in the last class and discuss it in this class. So is there any point you want to discuss? No, there's pin drop silence. Nobody's saying anything.
Ma'am, can you tell us the difference between homogeneity and systematicity? Because there was slightly a confusion. In homogeneity, it's written, ma'am, the homogeneity in such work is in terms of what men do in homogeneity part. And ma'am, systematic, how are they doing the work? Or like, I'm not able to have the difference between these two terms.
What he's saying is that actually what he's talking about is that this, this inquiry that he has proposed about our, philosophical, or rather the critical ontology that he has proposed about ourselves, about like, why do we do things as we do? Why do we think as we do? Or why are we what we are? This inquiry that he has proposed, he has talked about that inquiry in a positive way and in a negative way earlier. If you go back, he talks about the negativity, negative aspect of it. He talks about negatively, and then he talks about it positively. And then he comes to this part that he says that this experimentation that we have to take upon ourselves, this should not be global. It should be, on page 46, he says that it should be specific. It should not be universal. It should not be radical. It should not be global. And then he says that if it is not global, then we run the risk of being, consumed in a limited area. But then after that, he tries to justify his approach, and he says that, no, we will not, it may not be true that we will be limited and we may not come to a proper understanding of ourselves. And we, like he said on page 47, point number 3, where he says that we run the risk of letting ourselves be determined by general structures of which we may not be conscious and over which we may have no control. And after that, he says that it is true that We have to give up hope of ever acceding to a point of view that would give us access to any complete and definite knowledge of what may constitute our historical limits. Now, to justify that, he says that there is a lot at stake. That is why we have to take up this exercise. And this exercise is not disorderly. It is not limited in scope. Rather, it has a kind of uniformity. And that uniformity is in the technological aspect and in the strategic side of these practical systems, which are basically what men do, what they do and the way they do it. Okay, so there is a uniformity in that. And then he says that there is also a systematicity. We can follow a proper system when we take up this analysis, and that proper system will be guided by these three axes. These three axes are the the axis of knowledge, the axis of power, and the axis of ethics, or this relation that we have, the relations of control over things, the relation of actions upon others, and the relation with oneself. Okay, so here in the homogeneity and systematicity, he's talking about two different things. The homogeneity is the manner in which people do things, the way in which they do things, and the systematicity here refers to the method or the system by which we are going to take up this or conduct this analysis and inquiry. Okay. Anybody else?
Thank you, ma'am.
No other questions? Okay, then.
Yes. Like the questions can come from any part or paragraph. Like, for example, you told us about these three things: homogeneity, systematicity, and generality. So we need to study each and every point, like in brief or in detail, to go through the entire, like when we write the answer. So we need to use the words by Foucault, or can we use our own briefly explained things? Like, can we use our own words and terminology, whatever we require to write down the answer?
See, there are two aspects to this, your what is this orientation or the pre-PhD classes that are being conducted for you and the course that has been prescribed for you. One aspect is the test. Okay, you have to qualify the test in order to move forward. But on the other hand, more important than that is the fact that you have to understand how you can use these critical theories and these systems that you are studying in your own work. Okay, so if you have understood what they are, the test should not pose very much of a problem, because if you have understood what it is, you can explain it in your own words. Of course, the specific terms that have been used by these theorists, you will have to use those terms, or rather you will have to have an understanding of those terms, and you may use those terms in your answer if need be, if it is necessary. Now, about the questions, I don't know exactly what kind of questions you got in your, you have already had a midterm test, I think.
Got objective question.
Got objective question, the multiple choice type.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It mainly comprised of and all. It mainly comprised of literary criticism and, ma'am, structuralism, post-structuralism. It was taught by Shruti, ma'am. So everything was compiled.
What I mean to say that if your test is objective, if it is the MCQ type, then you don't need to explain anything. You need only to, choose the correct answer. So the question of using your own terms or using the terms that have been used by the theorist does not arise. That question arises only when you have to write a descriptive answer. When if your test is subjective or descriptive, it is only then that you will need to, explain and use terms or use your own terminology or those used by the theorists. Okay. So of
Okay.
course, from the point of view of the test, it is no problem. But from the other point of view, I think you should have a proper understanding of whatever you are reading, all the terms that have been used, all the concepts or the ideas that have been introduced. You should have a proper understanding of it, and you should be able to, rather put it into practical use wherever it can be put into practical use. That is the
Okay.
sense of this entire, study.
Ma'am, is the exam likely to happen in the online mode or offline mode?
When is your exam scheduled? I don't know when it is scheduled. When
Ma'am,
is it?
our final examination for pre-PhD will be in May, and
We don't know what the situation is going to be in May. Whether it's going to be, whether we're going to be free from the corona, situation, or whether it's going to continue. It all depends on that. It is all.
yes,
It depends on the situation and the condition at that time. The midterm test that you had, was it online or offline?
ma'am, it was offline test, ma'am.
Maybe it may be offline. Hopefully, we'll be in a better condition by May. So, I think there are 90% chances that it will be offline.
Okay, ma'am. And ma'am, what about the presentations we have to give? We have to present on a certain topic of our area of interest. So, how to go about it? Any
Suppose you
general
prepare a
idea?
PPT, you can prepare a PPT, and if it is offline, then also you can, make your presentation offline, and if it is online, then also, if you have a PPT. I don't know exactly
Yes.
what has been prescribed. I don't have an entire idea of the whole pre-PhD course, the requirements.
Sure, ma'am.
So,
Sure. Yes.
so we have 7 minutes before.
Ma'am, actually, certain guidelines have been given for passing the pre-PhD course, and they have prescribed that we also have to publish one paper with the ISSN publication. But as of now, we are just taking research methodology classes and reading essays. So, there is a lot of ambiguity in the sense of how to go about it.
Publishing your paper has nothing to do with your classes. A paper is something you write. It may not be exactly the topics that you have on your PhD course. It could be anything of interest to you. You could write a paper on any aspect of literature, any book that you have read, anything, any poem, whatever you like. Or if if you are interested in any of these theories, it could be an application of those theories to a reading of any book, anything.
Ma'am,
The paper,
okay, sorry,
so
ma'am,
you
I'm
write your
interrupting.
paper and publish it in a journal, and you can find these journals online. There are a whole lot of journals which have an ISSN number. So search for them, and they have these call for papers. So you write a paper and send it to them for publication.
Ma'am, but there will be a lot of proceedings, and it will take a lot of time, and we just have 3 months of time. So it's like a bit complex.
No, I don't see what complication there is in that. You write your paper and send it for publication, and they'll publish it in due time whenever. I mean, if they're asking you to for a paper for the next issue, which is to come out in March or whenever, the next issue, so it will be published in their next issue. So what is the complication there?
Ma'am, the complication is not that. Actually, we can write a paper and send it. but I have done this in past also, and I have been experiencing this, that they send a whole lot of proceedings, they send a whole lot of editing and all, and maybe it will take about 6 to 7 months for them to finally come up with the final thing. So, but our coursework ends in April, so how to go about it? Actually, I'm very scared.
No, no,
Sorry.
sir, just put your video on. I can't even see you. I don't know who I'm talking to. So,
Ma'am, actually, my camera is not working properly. I think I told you in the past also. It's not working properly, so it's not. I'm not able to on my video.
okay, okay, okay.
But
So,
you can see
you
my
know, the
photo.
first step is your paper. If you have your paper ready, send it to the journal, whichever journal you want to send it to. And what kind of, the editing and all that, of course, you have to proofread your article. You have to have it according to their requirements, the number of words or the, format where you will be,
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
you will have to write the abstract and you will have to write the keywords and then your paper and then your list of references and the works cited according to the MLA,
Yes,
you know,
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes,
so
ma'am.
all that you will have to follow.
Yes, ma'am.
So if you are following the
Ma'am, is
format,
it ma'am, is it necessary to publish the paper within the coursework only, or we can take more time?
I think you can send your paper, and if it is published within that period, well and good. If it is not, and if they have, they have assured you that they're going to publish it, then there shouldn't be any a problem. If your paper is accepted, the basic thing is that first they'll send you the acceptance of the paper, isn't it? So if your paper is
Yes,
accepted
ma'am.
for publication, then that should be okay.
Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. I'm irritating you a lot, but I have a lot of questions regarding this. So, so basically, I just want to ask that if by some circumstances or some reasons any student is not able to publish the paper within the coursework, so will he she be able to qualify the coursework or not? Because they have mentioned as my pre-PhD exam, so I'll be having a lot of problem in the sense of the paper publication, if I'm not
No,
wrong.
but then
So I
you
was
have to,
just asking that.
that's what I'm telling you. You have to have written a paper and you have to have sent it to for publication. Even if it isn't finally published, at least you have the, this thing, acceptance of it.
Yes, ma'am. It's just in the pipeline right now. I'm writing. I'm
So if
trying
you
to write.
have the acceptance letter that yes, your paper has been accepted for publication, that will be enough. That will be good. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, now in the next class, in the next 40 minutes, I am going to take up. Now, I had told you I would do the wretched of the earth, but since another person is already discussing it with you, the next topic that I'm going to discuss with you is resonance and wonder. Okay, I'm sending you the text on your group, and we'll discuss that today in the next class. Next class meaning the next meeting. Okay, I'm sending it to you. Okay, so have you got the this thing? Have you got it on the group through WhatsApp?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this is the text that we're going to discuss now. It is Resonance and Wonder by Stephen Greenblatt. Now, this falls into the critical school of New Historicism. So before we begin a reading of the text, now this text is comparatively easier to understand than the one that we were reading by Foucault. So before we begin a reading of the text, it would be good to have an introduction to New Historicism. Now this New Historicism was a critical method, you can say, of reading texts, and critical method of reading text, which is different from the system proposed by New Criticism or the structuralists, because it talks about, not only the text itself, but rather it also talks about the influences that have worked upon the making of that text. Now, I think, would you like to take down some notes, some points? So I'll just give you some, a brief introduction to New Historicism in the form of points, just so that we don't miss out on anything. So you can write this down, that New Historicism, I told you, is a mode of literary study that proposed don't write proposed. It is a mode of literary study which is post-structural in approach and which embodies concepts and procedures assimilated from various recent theories of literary and other writings. The prominent influences are number one, the views of the Marxist thinker Louis Althusser, that ideology manifests itself in different ways in the discourse of each of the semi-autonomous institutions of an era, and then number two, Michael Foucault's theory that the patterns of power relations at any given era in a society.
Can you pardon from that the pattern of
power relations at any given era in a society constitute the concepts oppositions and hierarchies of its discourse and in this way determine what will be accounted knowledge and truth. Then the third one is the central concept in deconstructive criticism that all texts involve modes of signification that war against each other merged with Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of the dialogic nature of literary texts in the sense that they present a number of conflicting voices And the fourth one is recent developments in cultural anthropology that a culture is constituted by distinctive sets of signifying systems
Constituted by distinctive
sets of signifying systems and the use of close analysis of a particular social production to recover the meanings it has for the people involved as well as to discover the patterns of conventions codes and modes of thinking that invest the cultural item with those meanings. Okay. New historicism
Is it a new point or from there itself?
cited in the next paragraph. New historicism is based on what has been called or what has been described by Louise Montrose. Now you will come across this in the text that you will read. Louise Montrose, Montrose, as, and then put it within inverted commas, a reciprocal concern with the historicity of texts and the textuality of history. Okay, close inverted commas. This approach is based on a number of precepts or concepts. Now the first one is that literature does not occupy a trans-historical aesthetic realm independent of economic, social, and political conditions, instead a literary text is simply one of many kinds of texts. And has neither unique status nor special privilege. Literary texts may represent a diversity of dissonant voices which express the subversive forces of the era in which the text was produced. Okay, the next point, number 2. History is not a homogeneous and stable pattern of facts and events which can be used as the background to explain the literature of an era or which literature can be said simply to reflect a literary text is said by new historicists to be embedded in its context as an interactive component within the network of institutions, beliefs, and cultural power relations, practices, and products that constitute history. Number 3. The humanistic concept, third point, the humanistic concept of an essential human nature that is shared by the author, of a literary work and the characters within the work and the audience or readers is an ideological illusion the major area of contest among new historicists is the extent to which an author may be able to retain some scope for individual initiative and agency. And the fourth one is, like the authors who produce literary texts, their readers too are subjects who are shaped and positioned by the conditions and ideological formations of their own era. All claims, therefore, All claims, therefore, for the possibility of or disinterested and objective interpretation and evaluation of a literary text are the illusions of a humanistic idealism. Okay. Okay, so this is just a little bit of an introduction that I have dictated to you. Now, when we come to a discussion of the text that we have to read, New Historicism proposed a method of reading a literary text along with a historical text, not as a background, but as a co-text. So for the reading and analysis of any literary text, a historical text would act as a co-text, not as a subtext. A co-text meaning something that had to be read parallel with the literary text, because the social political conditions which are being described in the historical text or in the text of history, those are the conditions which have shaped the literary text also. Therefore, the boundary between the historical text and the literary text is in a way erased, and they both merge into each other as, products of each other, so as to say. The literary text is the product of the historical condition, and the history of the time is also a product of the material production of the time. Okay, that is the method that is proposed by the new historicists. That literature does not, a literary text is not privileged. It does not occupy a superior position as an aesthetic piece of work. Rather, it is like any other text, whether historical or philosophical or social, any other kind of text. And the meaning that is contained in the literary text is the meaning which has been created by the social and historical and political conditions of the time. And in a way, it has been dictated. The meaning of the literary text too has in a way been dictated by the historical or by the historical conditions of the time, by the political and social conditions of the time. So, like it is felt that even the plot in a literary text or the solution that is offered to the plot in a literary text may not be the reality. It may be something that is superficial. It may be something that is deceptive, because that plot also has it has been constructed by the power structures, by the power relations of that were in existence or that were in force at that time. That is why any literary text cannot be read and understood in isolation. It has to be read along with a co-text, which is the historical text. Okay, so new historicism is basically a new way of reading and analyzing literature and history and the relationship between literature and history. Now, the text that you have to read is Resonance and Wonder, and it has been written by Stephen J. Greenblatt, who was a professor of humanities at Harvard University. And it was, in fact, Greenblatt himself who termed this, who coined this term, New Historicism, when he was writing an introduction to his essay, The Power of Forms in the English Renaissance. The Power of Forms in the English Renaissance. And what he meant by New Historicism actually was the attempt, it was his attempt to understand. He was a Renaissance scholar and he was a Shakespearean, he was a scholar of Shakespeare. So what he meant by New Historicism was his attempt to understand that history through literature and the literature of the time through its cultural context. Okay, so an attempt to understand literature through its historical context and to understand history through its literary context or cultural context. And that is why Greenblatt has also called this method of New Historicism a kind of cultural poetics. He also calls it or describes it as a cultural poetics. Okay, so let's start reading this essay. All of you have the essay, so I'll start reading it. I propose to examine two distinct models for the exhibition of works of art, one centered on what I shall call resonance and the other on wonder. By resonance, I mean the power of the displayed object to reach out beyond its formal boundaries to a larger world, to evoke in the viewer the complex dynamic cultural forces from which it has emerged and for which it may be taken by a viewer to stand. By wonder, I mean the power of the displayed object to stop the viewer in his or her tracks, to convey an arresting sense of uniqueness, to evoke an exalted attention. So right at the beginning, in the very first paragraph of his essay, he uses this term resonance and wonder. And resonance, the term resonance itself, which also means a kind of an echo, is the basis of the the approach of the new historicists, because he explains resonance as he says, the power of the displayed object to reach out to a larger world, to evoke in the viewer the complex dynamic cultural forces from which it has emerged and for which it may be taken by a viewer to stand. So this, here he has taken the situation of the museum, and it is he's also talking about the the skill of setting up museums, how museums display their artifacts, and what could be the different aims of the the curator in displaying the artifacts in that particular manner. And he says that all the objects or all the artifacts in a museum, they create two kinds of impression on the mind of the viewer. One is the impression of resonance and the other one is of wonder. And it is resonance, which is an echo, which is what the new historicists believe in, that any piece of cultural production, whether it is a sculpture, whether it is a literary work, they always have it has a power to reach out beyond its formal boundaries, the limited boundaries of that art form, to a larger world, and it evokes the cultural and the dynamic, the complex and the dynamic cultural forces which have gone in to create that particular work of art. By wonder, I mean the power of the displayed object to stop the viewer in his or her tracks, to convey an arresting sense of uniqueness, to evoke an exalted attention. And contrary to that is the experience of wonder. The experience of wonder is something that is limited to the present moment only, because it stops the viewer in his or her tracks, and it conveys an arresting sense of uniqueness. It is unique by itself. It stands in isolation, so as to say, and the effect that it has upon the viewer is an effect of awe. The viewer is taken aback maybe by the beauty of the form of that particular object, but that is the end of it. The viewer does not think beyond that sense of awe or wonder that is evoked by the aesthetic appeal of that piece. Whereas resonance is a feeling, it is an experience which takes the viewer back in time to those complex forces which had created that object of art. I should say at once that the scholarly practice that I myself represent, a practice known as the new historicism, has distinct affinities with resonance. That is, my concern with literary texts has been to reflect upon the historical circumstances of their original production and consumption, and to analyze the relationship between these circumstances and our own. I have tried to understand the intersecting circumstances not as a stable, prefabricated background against which the literary texts can be placed, but as a dense network of evolving and often contradictory social practices. So this is what I was telling you when I was giving you the notes, that new historicists, they do not view history as a background to literary texts, but rather history, the forces of history, they are not prefabricated. They are not to be understood as something that is constant, something that is prefabricated. Rather, they are a dense network of evolving and contradictory social practices. When analyzed, one will see how these historical forces, which have also led to the production of that literary piece, are contradictory, and they are dynamic. They are constantly changing. They are evolving. We do not have direct, unmediated access to these practices. They are accessible to us through acts of interpretation, not essentially different from those with which we apprehend works of art. So he says that these social practices that he is talking about, which led to the formation of that text. So these social practices are also based on the same kind of mental power, mental capability, which led to the, what he's saying here is that our understanding of these social practices requires the same kind of mental attitude or mental capability that is required for the understanding of a work of art. Okay. He says we do not have direct access to these practices. They are accessible to us through acts of interpretation, not essentially different from those with which we apprehend works of art. If in consequence, we lose the sense of reassuring solidity that an older historicism seemed to promise, we gain in recompense a far